What's going on, everybody? This is Mehul and welcome to your 41st AngularJS tutorial, in which we'll be discussing about shared and isolated scope in AngularJS directives, obviously. So in the last tutorial I quickly gave you an example how the directives in AngularJS fall back to a shared scope, kinda they share the same scope, all of the directives. And here's the example again. So if I click one of them, you can see all of the div having the my first script as a directive changes to hey there. Now this is because the scope is shared among all of these directives. Now we can prevent this thing by breaking each of the directive to its own individual scope, and to do that, in the return we have a property known as scope. Now this can accepts three values: either it is true or false, or it is a kind of object. So what happens with false is simply that you are just not writing anything else. So this line and this line technically means same. Now what happens with true is that with true your directive would create a separate scope for your your HTML element, but it would prototypically inherit from the controller as well. Now what was that? So to demonstrate that in simple words, let me show you an example. So right now we have nothing in our controller, and let's just quickly populate this up with scope, and scope dot controller property. Nothing fancy here. This is a controller specific property. Okay, so right there we have a controller specific property which is only specific to this controller, but this directives, as you can see, comes under these controllers, the ng controller app. So what happens with true is that this directive would prototypically inherit. Now prototypically, what it means is that if you already have seen my JavaScript tutorials, then you obviously know that, because I have discussed that in greater details in around tutorial number 11 to 17 or 18 or something like that. But for those who are not familiar with prototypal inheritance, it's simply kinda like how JavaScript works on the model of inheritance. Just like OOP works on the class inheritance or the object inheritance, JavaScript has its own model of inheritance, that is prototypal. Now prototypal is just simply a chain inheritance model. So for example, if I already have a property scope.controller property in here, then this code would make use of its own property instead of going to the controller. But for instance, let's say I don't have this property inside here, then what would happen is, as a chain, this directive would contact the its superior, something which is superior to this in a chain, because all of these are linked in a chain, and for now this is just the simple controller. And then this controller already has this property, so it will stop. If the controller would not have this property either, then this controller would look somewhere above it. For now we have nothing, but you can have the dependencies added here, but that's for some another day. So let's get back to the work, and for now we have created the simple controller property, and let's just hook this up in here. So instead of hey there, I'm just gonna say controller property. Okay, so what happens now is, if I reload this and click on this, okay, so we got controller property instead. Never mind, let's just create this as a function only, and let's just change this to scope dot controller property. Let's reload now. So when I click on this, you can see that this is a controller specific property, and the other two did not change. So that is kinda the effect of the scope true. And if I click on this as well, this is controller specific property, and this one as well. Now what happens when I change this to an object literal? So what happens now is that you technically do not have access to the controller property. Okay, so how the heck in this world are we getting access to this? Okay, so I haven't saved the file yet. Alright, so you can see now that the text is going blank instead of showing this is a controller specific property. Now the reason for this is that this directive has its own individual scope plus an isolated scope, which would, just would not be a part of the prototypal chain which this controller is a part of. Now in most of the scenarios you would like to have an individual and an isolated scope, because if you can access this property, you can actually modify this property as well from the directive only, and you don't want any, just a random directive on your page modifying your controller properties, because that could be fatal for your program. So yeah, so that's all for this tutorial, and some interesting stuff goes in here which we'll be talking real soon. And yeah, so that's pretty much it for this tutorial, and if you liked it, then don't forget to subscribe, and thank you for watching.